We are live.
All right, welcome everybody to the afternoon meeting of the House Energy and Digital Infrastructure Committee. It is January 22nd, otherwise known as Maria Day. And we are continuing our testimony, learning about, this afternoon we're going to be learning about broadband. So we'll quickly go around the table and introduce ourselves, committee members. Then we'll have all of our esteemed guests quickly introduce themselves and who they're representing. And then we will turn it over so that you can identify yourself for the record. So I'm Representative Kathleen James from Bennington 4 District.
Scott Campbell from St. Johnsbury, County, Essex.
Richard Bailey, Lamoille 2, and reside in Hyde Park.
Chris Morrow, Wyndham, Windsor, Bennington District.
Michael Southworth, Caledonia 2.
Christopher Howland, Rutland 4.
Dara Torrey, Washington 2.
Graham Kleppner, Burlington.
Morris Millian, Wyndham 2.
Hunter Thompson, I'm the Director of Telecommunications for the Public Service Department.
I'm Matt Mari, and I'm an intern for Representative James.
I'm Liv Goebel, and I'm an intern for Representative Sebelia.
I'm Maddie Kernan, and I'm also an intern for Representative Sebelia.
Andrew Brewer with Downs Ragland Environment on behalf of Consolidated Communications.
William Zakoff, representing the Vermont Community Broadband Board.
Evan Kern, an intern from the Grass.
Great, thank you. Jack.
Jack Locker, Committee Assistant, Wilson, Vermont.
Okay.
Maria Royal with Legislative Council. Nice to see you all again. And Jack, would you mind sharing the screen?
Nothing would bring me more joy.
So there is a presentation, and Jack's going to share it. It's posted on the website, and kindly will share it on screen up here as well. And I only brought 5 copies. And next time around, is 5 good? Does everybody want a hard copy? Just so I know.
Raise your hand if you're a hard copy person.
I usually am, but I'm not on this.
5? Okay.
5 is good.
5 is a good guess.
Because I saw them stop right here, but now it makes sense. Okay.
We have a digital divide.
Yeah, by the end of the session. Okay, so this is going to be an introduction to broadband, and we are going to refer back to some of the concepts and things we talked about earlier with respect to utility regulation generally and telecommunications regulations more specifically. But just looking at the table of contents, we're going to start at a very basic level. What is broadband? What are the types of broadband that are available? What are the different components of the network infrastructure? A very technical introduction. And then we're going to talk about the goals, some of the state goals about broadband connectivity, where we are currently meeting those goals. We're going to talk, of course, about the regulatory and legal landscape. Before we do that, we're also going to do a timeline of some of the initiatives that have happened in the last, since 2007, really. Just kind of touch on those so you can put each thing in historical context. Then we're going to look at the regulatory landscape. As you know, as we talked about earlier, the Communications Act is the overarching federal law. How broadband fits into that scheme, if at all, and what the implications are for your jurisdiction and issues that you might want to pursue going forward. And then lastly, touch on some of the emerging issues that are coming up in this world. So with that, what is broadband? So I'm actually going to read this definition. I'm going to pause for a second. So broadband is the transmission of wide bandwidth data over a high-speed internet connection. Basically, it's all of the means of accessing the internet other than dial-up service, because one of the other components of broadband is that it is always on. So you have a connection that's always on the internet. The old dial-up mechanism, you actually made a phone call from your phone and you called the server. So it was a phone call and you did not get connected to the internet from your home. So you hung up the phone, the call, the internet connection ended. So basically what developed when people started talking about broadband was when DSL, cable modem, all of the other things you traditionally think about, where you have a dedicated line, not connected to voice service, although they may run over the same wires, right? In terms of what is high-speed internet, or what's a high-speed internet connection, so that is an evolving metric. That also depends where you are and who wants to know. Importantly, people often refer to how the Federal Communications Commission defines what high-speed broadband is. And what the FCC does is periodically look at the technologies that are available, what their capabilities are, what the usage is, and determine what speed should be available to basically access all of the services that people use currently. So what should be the goal? Which minimum service should you have? And that's important at the FCC level in particular, because that's usually the minimum standard for funding, for federal funding. These are the areas that you're trying to bring service to if they don't meet this threshold. So currently, the FCC defines a high-speed internet connection as 100/20 service. So what that means is 100 megabits per second download and 20 megabits per second upload. Right, so they're not symmetrical. And that was recently changed. It was 25/3 for a number of years. It was 4/1 before. So it does evolve. I will just mention, and we'll talk about this more in Vermont in terms of funding of broadband grants. You set a minimum for service that meets 100/100 download and upload. And right now, fiber is the only service that's capable of meeting that standard. So, and does that make sense? Maybe I'm being too basic.
No.
Or is this helpful? Okay. Okay. And so the upload, the upload issue has become more of an issue, particularly since the pandemic, because people did a lot of remote work. They did a lot of Zoom calls where they were video conferencing. So they wanted to be upload their face, their own data, as opposed to streaming services or gaming, right? Not just entertainment purposes. There was an interactive component. So lifting up the upload speed to make sure that you could send information as well as receive information. So often the terms are used interchangeably. I'm not really, because I'm going to talk about broadband in Vermont, broadband availability, but I'm going to talk about lower levels of service, not just 120, but that'll become obvious to you when you see it. So in terms of the different types of connections, broadband connections, we're going to talk first about the wired connections, and then we'll talk about the wireless options. So for wired broadband, DSL service, digital subscriber line service, this is the service that was offered over the old copper telephone lines, right? You have your phone line, any phone line in Vermont is capable of offering DSL service. So they're just different frequencies over the same wire. In addition, and so then kind of you can tell that after DSL, which was people were using DSL quite frequently, and then cable modem service by your cable television provider became an option. Also a copper line, but coaxial cable, larger conduit, more information, capacity, more bandwidth. As I mentioned earlier, fiber optic cable, which is not copper, they're actually glass strands, tiny hair-like glass strands within a cable. They're actually pulses of light. I don't understand the electromagnetic spectrum very well. I'm not a physicist, but just a different means of delivering data. And right now, that's kind of considered the gold standard to have a fiber connection, because, and I don't even know what the capabilities are, gigabits, terabits, and beyond. So we're talking about megabits, but the capabilities are extraordinary. And then there are a lot of networks just to, be aware of that might be hybrid. So a lot of the cable television companies that have copper, they want to upgrade their lines to fiber because it brings their customers faster service. So they're in the process of doing that. Some of them have, some of them haven't. But then in the wireless sphere, you're all familiar with mobile coverage, not just for voice, but for data. You get a data connection. So you can have two different types of wireless. You can have a mobile service where you're able to use towers and travel and still pick up a connection. But you can also have what's called fixed wireless, which is becoming more popular recently at your house or in a geographic area. So fixed wireless access, you might have heard of some of the providers are offering a service. They have greater bandwidth capacity from their cell towers to provide service to regions. So you could actually get a pretty good connection in your home from your fixed wireless service provider. A distinction to be aware of in the wireless realm, when people refer to terrestrial wireless, they're talking about the towers, the antennas, the things that are located on Earth that transmit signals, as opposed to the satellite providers. So in the world of satellite providers, the old form of satellite, geostationary satellite, HughesNet, they were in the further orbits away from the Earth's surface. They weren't actually stationary, but they moved at the same speed as the Earth revolved. So it appeared that they were stationary. They were far away from the Earth. They covered a really broad swath of land, and they moved as the Earth spun. So they weren't stationary, but they appeared stationary, and they gave coverage. What you hear more about these days, and I know some of you know this already, but are the low Earth orbit satellites, so closer to the Earth. They don't cover as wide of a swath as land, but the service has much greater capabilities, right? So Starlink and Kuiper, Jeff Bezos says, I think it's called Kuiper. I didn't know how to pronounce that for a very long time. The satellites that are being launched low Earth orbit, this is where most of the build out is happening in the wireless realm, satellite realm. Does that all make sense so far?
Yes.
Okay. So then moving on to the network architecture, this is mostly just familiarity with some of the terminology that's used. There's a distinction made between last mile, middle mile, and the internet backbone. Most of the grants, when you talk about bringing service to customers, it's almost like the distribution lines and utilities. It's the retail service that goes to the homes or the businesses. That's what people are talking about when they talk about the last mile of broadband. And then middle mile, you don't have the connections to businesses or households, but they're usually strands that attach towns or maybe in between towns. So just a long stretch of wire. They refer to it as the node to the core, and the core network is the kind of the called the internet backbone core. So this is between states, between countries, between continents. These are those enormous cables. It can be wireless too, but more recently, I don't know, in the news, there have been a number of stories about the fiber cables, undersea cables that have been damaged and cut off service in whole geographic areas. So when people talk about the core, they're talking not just about the undersea, but those high capacity transmission networks. Yeah.
So I was just asking how you would define node.
How would I define node? I'm not sure if there's, I don't know exactly what
the
the
physical thing or is it?
I think it's a physical thing, but I'm not certain. Hunter's nodding, so he may know. Or I can, yeah. So I don't know exactly what that physical connection is.
And what scale is it? Is it how many nodes would there be for, I don't know, let's say for the city of Montpelier?
Yeah, that I have no idea, but I can.
10,000.
For the record,
For the record, I'm Hunter Thompson, Director of Telecommunications and Connectivity for the Public Service Department. I think Montpelier has a population of around 10,000 permanent residents, right? So I'd say there's probably 10 to 20 nodes.
Okay. So it's just sort of a junction box.
Yeah.
In effect.
So yeah, like I said, you can actually see a Comcast node from the cafeteria window looking that way. It's a big green box on a telephone pole, and it takes that fiber optic connection and turns it into coax cable that runs to all the houses.
Great.
Field trip,
Thank you.
field trip. Great.
And then just two other kind of terms that are often used: end users are the customers that receive or send upload information, and then edge providers, those are your content providers. I just wanted you to be familiar with the terms. So then talking, or getting to kind of where things stand currently, first, in case you weren't aware, in statute, Vermont has set the goal that by the end of 2024, every 911 business and residential location in Vermont has access to broadband capable of 100 symmetrical service. We are not quite there yet. Setting goals for broadband availability started probably in 2007. Granted, it wasn't 100, that wasn't the goal in 2007. Maybe it was 4.1, I actually don't remember. But the goal was to have ubiquitous broadband service by 2010. Then it was 2013, and so the standards have gone up of what you want. We've never actually achieved whatever those standard was. So this has been an evolving process, and obviously we haven't met the 2024 deadline. But in terms of where we are, and I'm sorry, this is really small print. This is taken from the department's website. With respect to current coverage in 2024, you can see about half of the state has access to 100, which is the goal. And then another 30 some odd percent has access to 120, which is the FCC definition. And then I definitely need my glasses. And then another 27% has access to 25.3, 19, am I reading that right now? Mm-hmm. Okay. And then
I blew it up behind you.
Oh, thank you. Okay, where are we? Oh, great. Yeah, so 6% has access to 4.1, and then in terms of the number of underserved that don't have access to 4.1, that's about 0.38%, so about 1,100 people, 1,100 locations.
And that's, okay, locations that don't have it. It's not an
That don't have
income.
access.
Okay,
Yeah.
no access geographically.
Yes,
Okay.
to 4.1.
Right. Yeah.
Do we know if that is concentrated in a certain area of the state or if it's spread out throughout the state?
That is an actual question, and the department does have maps where all of those locations are. So off the top of my head, I don't, but that is something that is mapped.
Okay.
And the most rural, least populated areas tend to be the ones where there is no service or little service. So of course it's all changing now because there are new technologies, which is always happening in this realm. So then I just included, because I just looked at this recently, just to give you an idea of what's happening nationally, kind of compare where Vermont is based on national average. This is data from a report that the FCC does, called the National Communications Marketplace Report. It does it every 2 years, and the 2024 report came out. It's based on 2023 data. And under that report, it specifies that more than a third of Americans have only one or no high-speed broadband provider. And of those 120 million fixed residential connections, people who do have access to fixed broadband, about 61% have access by cable connection, 23% fiber, 9% copper, 6% terrestrial fixed wireless, and 2% satellite. So that was interesting to understand what's happening, and again, it all changes pretty rapidly. So what are the challenges to universal connectivity? There are several, kind of well understood. These are the things that the state has been grappling with. Maybe first and foremost, the infrastructure cost. It's expensive and it takes a lot of time to build networks. Affordability, so people who actually might have access might not be able to afford it. Some technologies are expensive, either installation or the monthly subscription costs. And some populations struggle with lack of digital literacy, and the issue of digital equity sometimes comes up. Not having access to devices based on your income, and so on. And all of these things have been addressed in one way or another, and we're going to touch upon some of those attempts. And then, of course, the regulatory considerations, because what the state has been able to do is somewhat determined by what the FCC has said the state is able to do, and all of that is litigated all the time. So it's not like you can just say, everybody go out and build broadband, we're done, right? So I just wanted to mention that as a challenge for you. So now I just wanted to do a quick timeline of some of what's happened, and we can at any time go into the prior laws in greater detail, because there's a lot more than what I just included here, but I think it gives a pretty good idea of what's been happening since 2007. And so I wanted to start with Act 79 of that year, because that's when the state created the Vermont Telecommunications Authority, which is an entity that we referenced earlier. Not only did they have the authority to build out broadband, but also the wireless mobile coverage. So we talked about it in the context of telecommunications and expanding mobile coverage. So they had both goals: to build out broadband and mobile wireless, had authority to do grants, to do loans, to actually construct and own infrastructure, and authority to issue bonds, revenue bonds, to build network infrastructure. So a lot of authority to try lots of different things to accomplish the state's goals. And I'm going to talk more about what some of the challenges were with the VTA. But also, this was the act, and I think I mentioned this earlier, where 248A citing the alternative to Act 250 and local permitting, intended to speed up the process for large telecom builds, to have lots of towers. And this was also the act that gave municipalities the authority to issue revenue bonds if they wanted to build their own communications plant. So, before I get into the VTA struggles, in 2008, you'll all remember the Great Recession, number one. Number two, what was happening about this time, I think you're all probably familiar with EC Fiber. So this is a municipal entity. It was actually created in 2008. A bunch of municipalities got together and through interlocal contracts said, we want to build our own network. They had private investors agree to lend money, and they started to build their own network, and pretty successfully. I don't know how many municipalities initially, but they grew, right? EC Fiber grew. Their investors were paid back. I wanted to say that because it wasn't until 2014 when the legislature specifically defined what EC Fiber is, sort of. The issue with EC Fiber was they were successful, they wanted more access to capital, but when they went to Wall Street, they had a hard time explaining to people what exactly they were. They're like, what are you talking about? A bunch of like select board members or what, or like, we don't have a lot of confidence, right? But they were doing well. So they came to the legislature and said, you need to define us, what we do, so that we are a legal entity that's well defined and recognizable, and people don't think we're going to just be changing our contracts, right? That was a big impetus for the law that created what we know as the CUDs. There were also other entities interested in forming CUDs, and this became the vehicle. This became, okay, here's what they are, here's what they can do. So they're municipalities that join together to form a district. They have no taxing authority. That's significant. They can't tax, no property taxes, nothing. Everything they do is through revenue bonds, which they pay for through the subscriptions of anyone who signs up for the service. Nobody's required to sign up, but their goal is, what they believe, their business plan is, there's a demand, we can build it, people will sign up, we'll be able to pay for any debt we incurred, or if you get a grant, you don't have to pay it back. So that was the model, and that's what different, I think there are 9 or 10 CUDs currently. So back to the VTA, with the Great Recession, that was a problem for the VTA. Although they had this bonding authority, they weren't really able to issue any bonds, so just the access to capital wasn't there. Also, because of the recession, that's when the federal government stepped in with the American Reinvestment and Recovery and Reinvestment Act, ARA, the ARA funding. And the reason why that was important is because through that federal program, there was a considerable amount of money available directly to broadband providers in the form of grants to build out last mile, middle mile. So VTA was almost marginalized a little bit because now you had all this federal money compared to what's available now. It doesn't seem like all that much, but there was a lot of money. There were federal programs, the providers. So again, VTA, it interfered with what they were trying to do because now there's federal money. And in addition, at that time, there's the bankruptcy of SharePoint. There was the bankruptcy of, I think it was Adelphia. So there were things happening that it's just the timing. The VTA wasn't working. They weren't able to do everything that they had set out to. That's in a nutshell. This could go on for a long time, but that's kind of the basics of that entity and why when the legislature started looking at what do we do with this entity, because they're not issuing bonds, and that's really like $30 million or $40 million of bonding capacity. That's what they thought. None of it, never issued any bonds. And so eventually, and they weren't covering their own operational costs, so the legislature said we can spend this money elsewhere. Let's put them in a dormant status, and if the conditions change, they can be revitalized. In the meantime, everything that they have done will be transferred to the Department of Public Service. So that's kind of, in general, what happened. Quick, yeah.
Are you gonna talk about VTEL? Because I am here.
I'll let you talk about VTEL.
So at that same time, there was a $117 million investment in VTEL, which was to build fiber network in their telephone district, but also to build a fixed wireless network throughout the state of Vermont to cover virtually every last unserved address in the state of Vermont. And that is an important part of this story for me.
You didn't conclude the story. What happened?
Fixed wireless is not universal, and also they didn't build some towers, and I think that I'm going to remember that I am testifying in our committee and say that it was challenging to have them provide records to the Department of Public Service about what they were doing, because they're not regulated, even though they have this $100 million in public investment. So it kind of took the gas off the urgency, as they were going to take care of virtually every last unserved address. And so, 2015, thereabouts, we started realizing that hadn't happened, and we still had an emergency. So that's a little bit of stability editorializing. But.
And I think,
Another
connection of it was that they got federal money to do that, which then soaked up that capacity for anybody else to get federal money to build out broadband.
And I believe they got it, and Easy Fiber did not also at that time, which was interesting because they were proposing a solution for the whole state, which was controversial.
And that's an issue that comes up a lot. There are a lot of federal broadband programs. You'd be surprised all the different entities the money flows through.
For the unregulated broadband providers.
Right,
Yeah.
but also then, if you get all this money, say this is my service territory, you claim that territory, so the other federal programs are not gonna lend to other providers there because they don't have any confidence that it's gonna happen or it's gonna be viable, right? So it's a problem with committing with public dollars to do something and then other opportunities, there may be opportunity costs because if you don't do it and then suddenly other money that could have gone there now is gone, right? So that's a perennial issue that comes up in this world, I would say.
So, excuse me, but when we say terms like VTEL or the telecommunications companies, it seems that they have both a telecommunications hardwired window and they also have the wireless window. And at some point, are we going to discuss the regulatory? One's not regulated, one's regulated, so the different rooms of the house. At some point, are we going to discuss the integration or possible integration and regulation of crossing the gears?
Well, absolutely, and it's also one of those perennial problems because the same provider can provide potentially 3 different services through different modalities, wired and wireless. So the regulatory jurisdiction is something the state's constantly bumping up against. And with technology that's mixed use, it's cable television, but it's also broadband and it's also voice and it has other different restrictions.
I'm going to try not to relive a lot of this history, but I think I have an important example actually. So the VTEL issue really became clear to me. One of my towns, Reedsboro, said, we don't have service. What are you going to do? I was a new legislator. The Department of Public Service came, I think Consolidated came at the time to talk about what they had for GPS, but the Department of Public Service was not Hunter at the time, came with their maps and they said, well, it says actually all of Reedsboro is basically served. And that was because of this federal investment that had been made to cover virtually every unserved address through VTEL. And as it turns out, that tower had never even been built. So they weren't on a priority list. There was no funding available for Consolidated at the time to build to these areas, I think, because they were already covered by this other federal program. So, I mean, for me, what I learned there is, you know, companies will claim space, take federal dollars, fight being held accountable and regulated, and we just gotta kind of go along until we have, you know, an urgent situation. That was my takeaway. That's it. Sure.
So we already kind of jumped up to 2014-15, kind of went over the reasons why the VTA ended up going into a period of dormancy. Ultimately, it was repealed. It doesn't exist anymore on the books at all. As I mentioned, that was when the new division, telecommunications and connectivity, was created in the Department of Public Service. Hunter is the director of that division, and they took all the assets and liabilities of the VTA, became the successor in interest. Also at that time is when Vermont created its own broadband grant program, the Connectivity Initiative, funded through the Universal Service Fund, and updated the high cost program, which was a subsidy originally for building out voice service, became a subsidy for building out voice and broadband. In terms of broadband initiatives and efforts, in 2019, through Act 79, there were a number of things that were tried by the state And I'm just gonna kind of go through them generally to give you an idea of some of the efforts that already took place. But first, I just wanted to reference, we talked about the Vermont Universal Service Fund, and we talked about how it's funded by a fee on telephone bills. And that money goes to fund the programs that we've already talked about. In 2019, the legislature said, let's increase what was then a 2% fee to 2.4%. It's now a flat fee, 72 cents, but this was back then. When it did that increase, that incremental increase of 0.4%, it specifically designated all of that revenue for broadband build out for the connectivity initiative and the high cost program. Also at that time, the state established what was known as the Broadband Expansion Loan Program through VITA that providers were eligible for. The state provided some loan loss reserves to keep the interest rates down and lower the risk. As far as I know, that program still exists. I don't know, there were loans that have gone out, but I don't know what the status is. The executive director of VITA is Hedi. So it's gonna come to me in like 20 minutes. What's Joe Bradley? Anyway, so that might be interesting to find out what's happening there. But also, the state gave municipalities authority to enter into public-private partnerships with providers. There were studies looking at about how the electric utilities could maybe help because they were building out their own fiber networks for grid reliability and maybe lease some of that capacity or make it available for broadband use. Looking at whether, and this did not happen, but looking at whether municipalities should be able to issue general obligation bonds. So not just revenue bonds, but things that potentially could be funded through through taxpayers.
Yeah. On Act 2019, on 2019 Act 79. So that was my first year on the scene. And I am not, in my mind, Act 79 really turbocharged CUDs. And so I'm not matching up what I'm seeing on your slide with what I remember is this very clear, like, turning point for the establishment of CUDs. And am I misremembering? I know it was one of the first big bills I voted for, and then our CUD was formed, and there's
Act 79 got CUDs. Said everybody should do CUDs. Said nobody's coming to save you. Everybody should.
Well, I think, is it possible? Let's see.
71 was turbocharging.
okay.
Which is not.
It's not a big deal. Don't bog down.
No, I'm actually glad you asked that question.
71 is the next page.
So I think of that more as Act 71 in 2021.
Oh, well,
because
that be not remembering that.
Because that's when you set up the Vermont Community Broadband Board and specifically said this money should go to CUDs or to small telecom providers or to entities that partner with the CUD. So that was the huge universal community service through CUDs. I think that might be the...
Maybe I have my years wrong.
Maybe, but I also don't trust myself enough to say certainty. And the reason why I wanted to talk about some of the initiatives, because there were a lot of things that happened in 2019, a lot of attempts to build out different tools in the toolbox. That was the expression used at the time. And then COVID hit, which was very significant for a lot of people for a lot of reasons, but obviously broadband became much more essential to a lot more people. Also, that's when federal monies started to become available for infrastructure, not just broadband, but definitely broadband. Right? So initially, Vermont in 2020, right away, so CARES Act was the first federal funding mechanism for infrastructure, and Vermont was able to appropriate of that money $17.4 million for the accelerated broadband connectivity program. Again, line extension, customer support for cable line extensions, helping to defray some of the costs that the customer would be responsible for in areas that were not population dense. There was the program Get Vermonters Connected Now initiative, which had to do with funding, additional funding for areas that were maybe low income. I think the example that came up were mobile home parks, where it wasn't just building stringing fiber, but potentially maybe having to use underground cable, which is very expensive. So this was additional funding to help build out to those areas. There was a Wi-Fi hotspot program. A number of things that were made available with that federal funding. And then at the time, what was really interesting, and Representative Sibilia will remember, so when you think of all of the different things that had been tried in 2020, there's a realization that people need broadband. This is an essential service. So between 2020 and January of 2021, Representative Sibilia, Representative Briglin, it was like, okay, we have tried all these other things. Representative Campbell, what are we doing going forward? Like, we're not doing this piecemeal incrementally. And that's what led to what was then Act 71, where you created the Vermont Community Broadband Board to provide funding for universal solutions, right? No cherry picking, no incremental line extensions. You agree to cover a whole area, everybody in that area with 100/100 service. What was excellent, and this is only from a timing perspective, I'm not commenting on policy, is that because Vermont had worked so hard and had that ready to go in 2021, the American Rescue Plan Act first, which wasn't until March of that session. So Vermont was already well underway of creating this new entity to do broadband grants. Suddenly ARPA passes, tons of federal money. Later that year in November, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the biggest broadband spending investment ever. So you already had created a vehicle to receive a lot of federal money. So initially, on that 2021, because you were prepared through Act 71, you got $150 million of ARPA funding ready to go to the Vermont Community Broadband Board. And then later that year, actually the BEAD funding just became finalized. I think $229 million is the total that Vermont is getting. But that's been a process. And then in 2022, there was additional ARPA funding available that went to the board, another $95 million. And that could be, we're going to talk about the BEAD program more specifically in just a minute, but that could be used to help fund those efforts, and particularly there's a match requirement. And so big chunks of federal money. Vermont has set up a vehicle very much community CUD oriented. And that's, you'll hear Christine Hallquist will talk a lot about. Laura Spilly is on the board. So yeah.
So are you going to get into the relationship between the CUDs and the private companies and how that's worked out
in terms of
building
partnerships?
Well,
or competitiveness?
Competition, yes.
Well, I think a little bit, and this is really interesting because this was something I was going to bring up. Remember on that slide where we talked about market conditions influence how much regulation there should be if you have some competition, and with public utilities, often they're monopolies, right? But the CUD model is really interesting because they're building out primarily in unserved and underserved areas. But to get from,
Between areas that are served by private companies.
but yes, but they bypass, they go through, they in some cases overlap with competitors. And Vermont basically said, that's okay. If your goal is to provide universal service in an area, if there's some areas that are already served, we're okay with that. We're not gonna say no competitive overbuilds because you have a goal. But what it also has introduced into the discussion is this sometimes comes up with CUDs and confidentiality because they're trying to now compete and they have their own business plans and financial models, and maybe they don't always want to be 100% transparent about what their deployment plans are because that might competitively disadvantage them. And yet,
But there was municipalities.
they're municipal entities. The public wants to know and has the right to know, so there's a tension there, for sure. Yeah.
And then I'm also curious about the extent to which the CUDs have stimulated competition, have stimulated private companies to build in places that they might not have built.
That's a great question. I can't answer. The department might be able to answer, or the board. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll hear more, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
TBD.
And the only other thing, so obviously the goal of 100, and just to mention that the board, the VCBB, has a sunset date of 2029. It was not intended to be an entity that goes on indefinitely, but that it would have enough money to accomplish its goals, oversee those, the build out of those projects for a period of time, and then cease to exist. So the next page about the board, just a little bit more specifically, although I think we've covered most of this. The mission, it was created to coordinate, facilitate, support, and accelerate the deployment and implementation of universal community broadband solutions. Projects must provide 100/100 service. The eligible entities are CUDs, small telecom providers, and any private ISP if they're working in partnership with a CUD. We talked about what CUDs are, and we talked about, I believe the intent is that they become financially self-sustainable. That these are not entities that the state envisioned appropriating funds to, but eventually that their revenue subscriptions will pay for their operations and whatever maintenance and stuff. So that's the goal. And so, are you all aware of the documentary that, really? Okay. So this was, there's a documentary about Vermont's efforts in rural broadband. It was produced by, I think, Well Told Films in Randolph in partnership with the VCBB. It's actually really great. I saw it for the first time this summer, and it provides a good description about what some of the conversations and dialogue and efforts were and what's happening. So, that came out February of last year. It's pretty recent. So, maybe something, a movie night or something you might want to watch. So in terms of a lot of this federal funding that's going to the board through this, what's called the BEAD program, which stands for Broadband Equity, Access, and Deployment Program. Again, this is a last mile infrastructure program. Vermont's getting $229 million of a grant that's going to Vermont, which is going to the board, which is then going to be sub-granted out through the existing programs that Vermont has. And then just some other details, and Executive Director Halpus can talk more specifically about some of the projects and parameters, but under the federal law, the states have authority to competitively award sub-grants in the following priority. First, to unserved areas, and those are defined as areas that don't have 25/3 access, or underserved areas, which are below what the FCC considers to be high-speed broadband of 120. And then also to connect community anchor institutions with 1 symmetrical gigabit service. And community anchor institutions are schools, libraries, hospitals, community health centers, and that kind of thing. As mentioned, there is a matching requirement to draw down the federal funds, except in high-cost areas. So they're really difficult, hard to reach, and I don't know what the exact definition is, but Christine Hopkins will be able to tell you. And as I mentioned, there were some federal funds through a different federal law that could be used to help defray some of the matching costs. And then in terms of what the minimum project requirements, project has to provide service of at least 120. Vermont projects have to meet 100, 100. And then there are other performance service characteristics having to do with latency and outages. Can't have outages more than 48 hours on average a year, whatever. All right, so there are some other details. There's a requirement that a project offer at least one low-cost broadband service option. I haven't checked recently, but I believe that is left to the states who administer the sub-grants to define what that means for the state. And I don't think there's greater specificity at this time. But I'm gonna follow up and check on that. And then once they get the money, they have 4 years to complete the build out. So I'm not going to take a ton of time to go through this regulatory landscape because we've already covered it, and I know you all remember the salient details about the Communications Act, right? What's that? Yeah, right. So again, a 1934 model that applied to telephone that was mostly intrastate or regulated monopolies. This is the model that was created in 1934, and this bifurcation of interstate long-distance calls and local calls, and it all was pretty smooth, sort of. And then things changed, and we did talk already about some of the changes that happened with respect to cell phone service and the development of the cell phone, and then voice applications providing voice. Obviously, we didn't talk, but obviously, the internet. And also cable television. This was interesting because I actually didn't know this until I started looking into it. I didn't realize that cable television initially was used to pick up broadcast signals that didn't reach certain areas. So people would put a cable to a big dish and then use the cable to go to, right? It wasn't until the 70s that there were designated programming options available through cable television. It was just a means of getting better broadcast television, right? So a lot of evolution in that world, just in terms of programming, and then of course with cable modem, the ability to connect to the internet. That's happening. We talked about the breakup of the Bell system and the deregulation for long distance local, we talked about for cell phone service. The thing that's, I think, most interesting about the early years of dial-up broadband access over a phone line, the highlight, it does come up better there. I think what's really interesting is for this period of time, and part of what set the stage for how broadband is defined, going back to dial-up, the state regulated the phone companies entirely, essentially, right? Accessing the broadband was a phone call. So the state essentially regulated your provider. You had to bring service to people who want phone service, right? So broadband wasn't a separate dedicated line that we think of. And so when people talk about the early days of there was no regulation, it's like, well, there was, because you regulated the phone company that had to provide the phone service, right? So I think it's something that kind of informs discussions about why decisions may have been made. Of course, that changed when DSL, a direct line became available through, and then service through a cable modem. So that's when the dial-up era became the broadband era and the build out of those connections. And yet, you know, the DSL and the cable, that was 1996. So that was coincidentally when the Telecommunications Act of 1996 was passed by Congress. And as we discussed earlier, this was a big policy shift towards deregulation of the telephone markets, which also happened in Vermont. And then a push towards deploying advanced information technologies. And in one moment, I'm going to talk about two definitions that are significant, but just before I get there, to give a little more context, in 1998 was the Internet Text Freedom Act. So there was this idea that broadband access is this new service, this nascent industry. The federal and state regulators should really just let it evolve, let there be innovation, don't do much. That's not required, and if anything, competition will be inspired, and that will be better for everybody. So also, along those lines, in 1998, there was a moratorium on taxing internet access service. So while service is being built out, the Congress said, states, we don't want you to tax this new service, people's broadband connections. You can put a fee on telephone service like you've been doing. We don't care about that. We don't want you to tax this new service. We wanted the business to grow and innovate and more money to do capital investments, right? So that was meant to be a 3-year moratorium. It was extended and extended and extended, and then it became permanent law still just today, since 2016. It's a very different world that we live in. And I think it's universally acknowledged that it doesn't maybe need the help like to grow. So that may change. And we're going to talk about that also a little bit more. So the classification issue. How much time do I have?
We're good. Well, we have to be on the floor at 3, right?
Oh, okay.
I think we're in great
good.
shape.
I think we're good.
Yeah, we didn't squeeze you in on this one.
Okay, no, this is great. So in the 1996 Act, there were 2 definitions that were added to Title I because it's the general provisions definitions section. It's not regulatory authority for a particular service, but there are definitions. And one definition is for information service, and another definition is for telecommunications service. If you're a telecommunications service, you meet this definition, then you're considered a common carrier, and you are potentially subject to all of the Title II common carrier regulations. Doesn't mean they're all going to apply, but it means potentially the regulators could apply this large number of regulatory mechanisms. If you're an information service, though, people describe it as you're subject to the light touch regulation under Title I. And really, there is no real regulation under Title I. It means you're unregulated, essentially. Yeah. Which is not to say that advanced telecommunication services are mentioned throughout the Communications Act in various sections, but not in a coherent way, not in a way that says this is what it is. It's an information service. You can't regulate it. You want to regulate it, go back to Congress and have them change the law. It's been this ambiguous thing about how do you define broadband internet access? Is it a transmission service? Or is it the offering of the capability for generating, acquiring, storing, transforming, processing?
So, sorry. I'm combating minor brain meltdown, but I know I can recover. Is broadband currently Title I? Or is it some is Title I and some is Title II, and is that what everyone's fighting about?
So if we go to the next slide.
Great.
And there is a tiny fraction of what's been happening with broadband. So the short answer to your question, and it isn't even a short answer. In 2024, the FCC classified broadband as a telecommunication service. And in part, one of the reasons for doing that, and it had been done before, right, is to apply things like net neutrality standards. They're common carriers. They shouldn't be doing anything with your information. They're transmitting data. There are also privacy concerns, and there's authority under Title II to impose privacy protections on consumer data. So there are a number of reasons why you might want to regulate like a Title II. So the FCC, and I'm just jumping out of 2024, said, we believe it's a telecom service. And in the past, it had been reclassified numerous times by different administrations with different policy objectives. And typically, when the courts reviewed those classifications, the courts deferred to the FCC. Said, you're the experts. We're going to defer to however you want to classify it. Here's where we are now. That reclassification order was challenged in federal court, and the Sixth Circuit ruled, one, we're not applying Chevron deference anymore because of a recent Supreme Court case that basically said we're no longer going to we're not going to defer to the agencies of expertise like we've been doing in the past. It's just giving too much authority to the regulators. So decades of deference to rules, and if there's an ambiguity, letting the administrative agency of expertise make a decision about what the intent is, how it should be applied. No more deference. That's the Supreme Court. That was the Loper Bright case people talk about. You're not going to be afforded that level of deference. Instead, we're going to look at the language of the statute, not what you think it should be. And the court, this is the court speaking, we're going to read the plain meaning of the statute. And we're going to decide if you have the authority to classify it, or if not, what we think, how we think it should be classified. So the Sixth Circuit said, basically, looking just at the plain, we're not going to defer to the FCC. We look at the plain language. We look at these two definitions that were just up on the screen, and the Sixth Circuit said that broadband internet access is an information service. So that's where we are now. The prior FCC order, which likely would have been repealed anyway with the change in administration. Typically, the Republicans have been more deregulatory, just typically, not everybody, all right? But the courts now weighed in and said the plain meaning of the statute. What's fascinating to me about this is that way back in 2005, when the Supreme Court looked at how cable modem internet service should be classified, the majority basically deferred to the FCC and said, okay, it's an information service. Justice Scalia wrote a really strong dissent that said, forget the deference. I'm looking at the plain language of the statute. Cable modem service is a telecommunication service. Why that was a dissent and not the majority, or why that hasn't been picked up, I don't know, because it makes the most sense when most people think about interpreting that. That's not, maybe I'm wrong, I am wrong, because that's not what the courts have held. But here's the other interesting thing. Justice Thomas joined with Justice Scalia in that 2005 case, and then more recently has said, that was wrong. So it's crazy, I'm telling you, trying to understand what the courts are going to do and why it's talk about brain meltdown. So this is a representation of how the different classifications are. So right now, it's classified as an information service, broadband is.
And that is a federal / court jurisdictional thing that we can't do anything about.
You can't. However, this is the thing, and this is what was so interesting about, so there was a prior order under the prior Trump administration. Ajit Pai was the chair of the FCC. You reclassified the old telecom to information service, just right? And so this is information service, do not regulate. Not only that, we are gonna issue a broad preemption directive that says no states can regulate. We're not gonna regulate and no state can regulate. That was appealed, and that was the Mozilla case. And what was very important about that holding, in terms of the classification at that time, they just deferred to the FCC. You can classify it as information, whatever, you can do that. But this preemption directive, you have no authority to do that. None whatsoever. If it's an information service, you don't have any authority. There's no grant of authority to regulate information service. If you don't have authority to regulate it, you certainly don't have authority to tell states not to regulate it. This opened the door for states to consider enacting their own regulations, using their own police powers, their own general, acting in the public interest. So California actually enacted a net neutrality law, which was similar to one of the earlier open internet orders. And we're going to regulate providers, and we're going to regulate their network management practices, and we're going to make them comply with all of the network neutrality requirements that the FCC had tried to do. You can't block, you can't throttle, you can't interfere with people's access to the internet or their content. So California enacted that state law. That was, of course, immediately litigated, and ultimately the Ninth Circuit held they're within their authority to do so based on the circumstances in California, what the reasoning, what the data was, and what the need was in California. So that law was upheld. The court also indicated, doesn't mean every state can in every circumstance, but it means it's possible. And it's really going to be what the court basically said was it's a fact-specific inquiry. What does the state want to do? What are your objectives? What is the need? How compelling is it? What is the burden on interstate commerce, which is traditionally in the realm of the federal regulators, but if they're not acting, if they don't do anything, then it becomes balance with the states trying to do against the burden on interstate commerce. And if it falls in favor of the state's efforts, then the laws will be upheld. So that's the interesting place that we're in right now. So states may try different things. New York, for example, I'm jumping ahead of myself just a little bit. Similar issue in New York. The state of New York passed a law that said to internet service providers, you have to provide a low income plan or a low cost plan for low income households. Only $20, no more than $15, and $20 in some instances. Immediately appealed. You can't regulate rates of broadband. That is economic regulation, the utility regulation. No way, you can't do that. The Second Circuit recently held, I guess April maybe of last year, that no, based on the state's Consumer Protection Authority and the need and the lack of broadband in some areas and the essential critical nature of broadband, it's within the state's authority to implement such a proposal. So those are two cases in the federal court system that are upholding state efforts to regulate in the broadband sphere.
Does that mean Vermont could do that? Does that mean any state can do that?
Possibly. And I think that, so, but again, and I think the courts are pretty clear, it's going to be fact specific. So what is the need? What are your goals? What is the data supporting what you want to do? So just building that record. And does all of that outweigh any burden on interstate commerce? Or, is it so drastic that it interferes with federal objectives of building out a nationwide? But that's very.
Does that get into data privacy questions?
Absolutely. Absolutely,
Yeah.
yes.
Interesting, all right. Not that I'm saying anything one way or the other, I just wonder what the landscape
Yeah,
is.
but I think the important part is just building a record, really understanding what it is you're trying to do, be very, very intentional about it, and making that case. And I think in prior pieces of legislation, I think Vermont was arguing by putting requirements on service, you're actually going to promote competition. You're going to, because more people are going to have access, more people are going to use it. So there's this, trying to argue in the way that what is best for Vermont, the Vermont economy, and not too deleterious to the larger, broader economy. So that's
Great.
So the other issue, and this is really the universal service fees, is it what I'm at? This is mostly just to bring to your attention that universal service fund at the federal level, which is also funded by a fee on telephone bills, but only on the long distance portion of your telephone bill. And it funds federal programs like a high cost program, Lifeline, right? So that is being litigated. That's been challenged in several district courts. The plaintiffs have argued it's actually not a fee, it's a tax, and a federal agency doesn't have the authority to tax private entities. The FCC has basically said no, it's a regulatory fee. And we're basically funding the programs that we were set up to fund. So the FCC prevailed in two circuit courts, the 6th and 11th circuits, and did not prevail. The plaintiffs who challenged the funding mechanism prevailed in the 5th circuit, narrowly. So that is currently on appeal before the U.S. Supreme Court. And so that doesn't necessarily mean anything for you, except that it may impact what's happening at the federal level, what kind of federal monies are available through the federal Universal Service Fund. Given that the 6th Circuit, 11th Circuit, and the 5th Circuit was so close, and the 5th Circuit is one of the more conservative courts, I would be really surprised if the Supreme Court struck down the financing mechanism. I could be wrong, definitely could be wrong. But, and then this issue of federalism, so we kind of touched on this, the state's authority versus the federal government's authority. So what this is really getting at, and I hope this isn't too legally in the weeds and boring, but so the federal government is one of enumerated powers, right? The right to regulate interstate commerce. There are very specific powers in the Constitution. Everything else that's not enumerated falls to the states. So if Congress is acting based on one of its enumerated powers, then that's the supreme law of the land, and it controls. What's emerging more and more is this conflict between what the federal government can do under its enumerated powers, like the power to regulate commerce, and what the state's residual power is, because everything is becoming interstate. Everything is becoming. So how trying to negotiate those jurisdictional boundaries, it comes up in taxes, it comes up in almost every economic sector. What can states do? And at what point can they push back on Congress? And it's a really interesting issue because states' rights issues, depending on who you're talking to politically, it's kind of you hear from both sides, right? There are people adamant about gun rights or abortion laws or major, policy issues that should be decided at the state level. And then there are people that are at the same time, but don't regulate broadband or vice versa. So trying to, have some integrity and say, okay, what are the rules here? What are we allowing states to do? Because everything's interstate. Everything has So I think that's all I really wanted to say about that, because we already talked about the two cases that are relevant. And then, so these are some of the emerging issues, which I think we already mentioned, some of the privacy, affordability, broadband, the grid, spectrum, geotechnopolitics, and then somewhat of an administration, forecast about the Trump administration. And some of this I get really, really big picture because it's more fun to kind of put things in a global context, and I could use better images. So, but privacy, we talked about this already. States have authority to enact privacy rules. They can act in general comprehensive privacy rules that apply to all businesses, including broadband providers, right? And I just included here, there was an FCC privacy rule that was then repealed by Congress, the change of administration. But that's just a note that that's something that's happening. The affordability issue, there was what was called the Affordable Connectivity Program. There was an emergency benefit program during COVID, and then that was built into a bigger program to provide subsidies to low-income households. There was money provided, $14.2 billion, and basically ran out of money. All the money was spent. The program is now ended, but there was a lot of, and I would say, bipartisan discussion and support for continuing the program, trying to come up with it. It never happened, but it's an issue that Congress might take up, and I just wanted to kind of flag it as something that people have been interested in. Yeah.
May I make an editorial comment from my own experiences here?
My experience with you, Representative Sedalia, is that you don't necessarily seek permission, so why don't you do your thing?
So, the ACP, when those funds were coming in, it was our understanding that those funds were going to come in and be available for build out of infrastructure for unserved areas, and at the last moment became an affordability program, largely led by National Telecoms, which then really just became a public subsidy for these large national providers instead of being invested in the build out to areas that were unserved. And because it's so darned popular, that word affordability, it's something that's hard to argue against. And those subsidies to these large companies that spend hundreds of millions of dollars to keep from being regulated and seek a lot of public investment every year are sought to be continued. Editorial.
No, point well taken. Definitely part of the dialogue about the program. So then I just wanted to talk briefly about broadband and the grid, the power grid. And so I think we talked a little bit earlier about grid modernization. Most of the utilities are building out broadband for their own purposes to monitor the use of electricity at locations in the customer or business premises through smart meters. And it's been a way for them to monitor the system, to understand very quickly where the outages are, et cetera. So that's been an ongoing initiative. There have been federal funds for smart meters and smart meter deployment. And one of those areas where energy objectives align with broadband objectives, trying to build out communications network infrastructure for two different purposes, but overlapping purposes. Sometimes the discussion around this becomes up in terms of equity because there are programs that enable electric customers to take advantage of dynamic pricing, peak hours, all of those things that Ellen can talk to you about. But if you don't have access to broadband, if you don't have the smart meter, then you can't avail yourself of those programs. So there's an equity component that sometimes comes up in that world as well. The other issue to think about in terms of the power grid, and I don't know how much this is going to be an issue in Vermont, but certainly something people think about. There are very heavy powered data users, such as the servers and data processing required for AI, artificial intelligence, for crypto mining. I actually also cover securities. So at some point, I'm going to need to understand cryptocurrencies and crypto mining. I don't. So that's next week.
Nor do we.
Okay, I tried. But anyway, but mostly I'm talking, so the network, the fiber and the power to these entities and content delivery networks. The big content providers wanting to have servers closer to their users, that helps make their service better. But they're all heavy users of power and of broadband. So I don't know if there's really a guy with a cowboy hat in every crypto mining facility, maybe just in Texas. But,
Yeah, Representative Galen.
Did Vermont get any of the 14.2 billion of that,
the affordable,
the affordable
Vermont
connectivity?
first did. It was a subsidy for Vermont, for anybody that met the threshold, the low income threshold.
okay.
So some Vermont, I don't know how many
Okay.
people in Vermont were able to avail themselves of that subsidy. So then spectrum management, this is not something that you can regulate. This is regulated at the federal level. But it's fascinating because this is just the radio spectrum of the electromagnetic spectrum. And what it attempts to do, and I know you can't read it because it was too blurry, but this, yeah.
I'm sorry, I have no idea what that is.
Yeah, no, so these are all of the licenses and the licensed users of spectrum. So the wireless providers, right?
Madam Chair, may I?
Yes.
You may.
I think it would be helpful to go back again. I know you did spectrum definition before, but just another definition of spectrum and who uses it and how it's acquired.
Okay, so this
I'm
is,
stuck back there.
yes, so this is transmission of data, voice, anything, over the airwaves. There is a limited amount of spectrum available to users, and so it's licensed. Having bandwidth, getting bands of frequencies to deliver service is licensed at the federal level. NTIA, I think, does government, like military use of the spectrum. The FCC does commercial use of the spectrum.
For us people who are older, this was television and radio.
Yes, so this, and it still is. And it still
I was
is.
just gonna say, it still is, because I use an antenna. I
Yes.
don't have cable.
Yes, it still is. Broadcast television, radio, everything. All the communications over the airwaves.
And it's finite amount of spectrum.
It's finite. It's finite. I'm a philosophy major, so.
It's finite because,
Well, it's based on the technical capacity.
okay,
And our ability to use what exists currently. So the technology is always evolving, and they're always trying to, split frequencies or put more data on more frequencies. So I would say it's evolving, but it is finite. And so some of the spectrum is high bandwidth spectrum that's extremely valuable. So there are often auctions at the federal level and providers bid because they want to own more spectrum so that they can build out their mobile service, their fixed wireless access service, right?
FirstNet
FirstNet was awarded some public safety designated spectrum just for public safety. So, and that, I don't know, I wish I knew where it was on here, but that was set aside specifically for the build out of this FirstNet broadband wireless network for first responders, basically. Although it could be used, any excess capacity for commercial purposes, but.
so what we're looking at is the whole spectrum, each thing is the different frequency and then broken up by who's got the space.
Yeah, they're
Wow.
different bands.
Okay, I've come a long way in about 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And this was really just to show like how valuable it is and what's happening. And when you look at companies like Kuiper or Starlink, all the wireless providers, they all need spectrum to deliver their services, right? The FCC, commercial use is regulated FCC. And so we're getting very close to the end. And so I think this is interesting. So bear with me because I had fun thinking about this. So I just labeled it geotechnopolitics. So does anybody know what that first image is over there? Other than a copyright violation. Yeah.
Sputnik.
Yeah.
Wow,
Yeah.
okay.
So 1957, right? The Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first low Earth orbit satellite. So all of these LEO satellites, this was the first one that successfully launched in 1957. The Soviet country. It sent shockwaves through the United States government, mostly because it was a Soviet country. And so it was kind of, I'm not a historian, but a lot of people think of that moment in time as being the impetus for a lot of money in this country going towards advanced research projects. DARPA was the Defense Advanced Resource Projects Administration, which was formed maybe even months after Sputnik was successfully launched, very quickly. And at the time, Senator Johnson, before he was president, he was senator, maybe majority leader, was adamant about the United States can't fall behind in the space race. And then he has this great quote where the Romans controlled the world, the Roman Empire, because they controlled the roads. The British controlled the sea with their shipping, and the U.S. for a while airspace, and now whoever controls outer space is going to be controlling the world, basically. I mean, it was this huge kind of like, and so, because at the time, President Eisenhower didn't feel motivated to spend large amounts of public dollars on this kind of research, but the narrative that Johnson was able to promote eventually prevailed. So DARPA was formed, and then after DARPA, NASA. So that's kind of the beginning of the space race, right? I also wanted to mention that because it's through DARPA that the internet was basically, the early stages of the internet was developed, right? Through a public program, partnering with private entities and research universities. But it's kind of the birth of the internet, the personal computer, GPS, not even going to get into the NASA things that happened, right? But to me, it's very interesting to think about where these programs started and what the context was and where we are now. So the ITU, I wanted to reference International Telecommunications Union, which is an international body that kind of regulates stuff related to communications and what the standards are. I already talked about the politics of these undersea cables and the vulnerability of losing connections. Because there literally are just these big cables on the bottom of the sea. So I don't know how many there are, but obviously it's critical infrastructure and probably it is confidential. But and there have been a lot of reports in the news lately about whether was there a dragged anchor that disrupted the service, or was it some kind of cyber intentional act, right? So the vulnerability of having these bottlenecks. I think, one that came up was, under the Red Sea, like there are cables there and they serve large areas. And so the importance of communications and networks and reliability. And then the last slide is just a picture of ports, but minerals. that are used in technology. Quartz is used, is one used, but who has access to minerals, and so on. And so the very last slide is just about the Trump administration. And so right now, Brendan Carr, who was an FCC member, is officially now the chair of the FCC. And he also authored the telecommunications chapter in Project 2025, which gives somewhat of an indication of at least what he's thinking and what his goals might be. So interestingly, one of the things he talked about is reining in big tech. And he wasn't really talking about the providers as much as the infrastructure providers, as much as the content providers, the Google, the Facebook, the Amazon, the news outlets. He has a real concern about the content providers, and his concern has mostly to do with diversity of ideas and opinions being available on content. So no political discrimination. It's an interesting issue. I'll just say that. And the reason why it comes up in the FCC, this is one of those statutes in the Communications Act, Section 230. Part of Title II basically says that content providers are not liable for what third parties post on their sites. That has gotten a lot of attention. It's also a little bit odd to think that the FCC is the entity that should be regulating what the content moderation standards are. That's just not typically something that the FCC would do. It's not, right? Again, it's not necessarily the internet service provider, it's the applications of the software and the content provider. So, but that's an issue you'll hear about. The one thing that he did say that could be a sign of what's going ahead. We talked about the Universal Service Fund and the fee on long-distance telephone to pay for that. I believe he has proposed expanding that fee and applying it to the content providers. So these big users of the internet, that they should maybe contribute to the fund. And then he has a lot of concerns about national security, cybersecurity issues, and supply chain, the equipment and the hardware coming from different countries that might not remain friendly. Yeah. He's also talked about supporting low Earth orbit satellites and the further commercialization of the spectrum, and promoting competition and market forces. And then the very last thing I put on here, because Elon Musk does have a role on DOGE, Department of Governmental Efficiency, an advisory role to the White House Office of Management and Budget. He has a number of contracts, both through SpaceX and Starlink, and so obviously, his viewpoints on development of his own programs and technologies may influence in some way what happens with communications. It's just something, and that's all I have. Thank you.
Wow. Yeah, Victoria, I have a question back where you were talking about Chevron and Loper Bright. Is Chevron the name of a decision?
It's the name of the decision.
And something happened with that recently.
Loper Bright is another decision.
It was a decision that overturned it, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So the very last thing that I wrote under Elon Musk was eliminate rates contrary to recent Supreme Court decisions. So all of those regulations for the administrative entity was deferred to resolve an ambiguity. Maybe they don't have the authority to do that.
Like the FCC?
Yes.
EPA?
Yes. Yes. No, so that's exactly what happened with the FCC, in the Sixth Circuit.
Which means Congress has to be much more specific in intent.
That's what the holding says. These are big questions, and for federal entities, it's too much delegation of authority to individuals that are not represented, are not elected officials. So be more specific, be clear. Honestly, there's always going to be some ambiguity. So where they draw the line, because you try to implement things, you can't foresee everything. It's impossible. So But yeah.
Yep, I think we lived that.
Yeah. Now you know everything.
Rep. Hubner and then Bailey?
You know as much as I do.
Thank you.
We have a few more questions, believe it or not. Yeah?
On the subject of whether those internet trunk lines were caught by a stray anchor, I would just say that based on the time that I lived in the Soviet Union and in Russia in the post-Soviet era, it was totally the Russians.
Representative Bailey?
Yeah, and what was the Chevron decision?
So this was a decision, I don't know, maybe it's like 30 years old, I don't remember. It's a Supreme Court decision that basically said, if there's an ambiguity in a federal law, it's not really clear how it should be decided, but the federal entity that, with the expertise that's responsible for administering the law makes a determination, then whatever their determination, whatever their interpretation is, will be given deference by the courts. And so when that was recently repealed in the Loper-Bright case, the Supreme Court was now saying, we're not going to do that so liberally anymore. We're not going to defer. There are too many policy questions that are being decided by federal agencies who are not elected representatives. So the reach of that is still to be determined.
Thank you.
All right, that was so helpful.
I hope so.
Yeah, but Maria Day was excellent. I thought. So,
you get one day.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I would just add that Maria Day will get everyone in this building very excited. And there are a lot of people that care very much about telecommunications and our Hedi community care about telecommunications. So I would expect everyone of us to hear from them.
Great. Thank you for Maria Day. We really appreciate your testimony.